Hello friends, so for today's video I wanted to go over if you have watched Dune, Witcher, Wheel of Time, and Shadow and Bone, I should say, some information that you might want to know before jumping into the book. I'll have timestamps down below if you're only interested in some of the information that I mentioned in this video, as well as other videos I have done that go over some of these particular stories a little bit more in depth. But either way, jumping into it, I'm going to start with Dune. This is one that I think has been explosive and very highly praised. A lot of people ended up really loving this particular adaptation, and I read the book right before going to see the movie. This is one of the few times that I actually think reverse order works to your benefit, where watching the movie adds a lot of context to what you're going to get in the book. So if you've watched the movie first, I think you're actually going to get more out of the book. Frank Herbert's writing style is very much a tell you everything you need to know, but he does it in such a forward way that there's not necessarily a lot of room for passion. There's not a lot of room for character relationship building. You're not going to see yourself connecting to a lot of what's going on in the typical entertaining way you might with other fun, adventurous sci-fi stories. With this particular one, I would say it's much more thematic, and it's something that you almost have to sit back in order to appreciate what he's saying, and sometimes you need to sit back to even understand where he's going with things, and this is where I think the movie is going to fill in some of the gaps for you. So you still have the same setup where you have this particular royal family or important family going to this planet, and there's this important thing on this planet that it seems a lot of people are interested in. That alone, I think, already ties to a lot of things transpiring in modern times, so that's an example of something that you can see being more thematic. But either way, if you're going to pick up the book, just know that it's probably not going to be a really fun type of story, and a lot of the visual things that are done in the movie that are extremely stunning, those are described very briefly in the book. There's a particular scene in the movie that takes place over a decent amount of time. It shows you the sandworms, and it's made out to be a really big deal in the movie, and it's this awesome scene. And in the books, it happens so fast that you're like, and then there's the sandworm, and then it moves on, and you almost need a second to be like, wait, did that just happen? And it takes a second to really recognize what he just told you, because he really does just go through everything really quick. Another thing to note is that the movie actually only adapts the first part of the first book of Dune. So you will read through a certain chunk, and then you'll get to a point that was actually the end of the movie, and then the rest of the book is not covered in the movie because they're breaking the movie up into two separate movies in order to adapt this one book. I think the best way to put it is that Frank Herbert doesn't really hold your hand when it comes to how he approaches giving you information and exposition. He definitely lays it all out there, but it's so blunt that it might be a little jarring, especially if you're used to more modern stories that really want to bring you along and make sure you understand this fantasy or sci-fi story. Another thing to note has to do with the writing style, which is very different, likely due to its time period that the book was written, and that's the concept of head hopping. So nowadays, when we're picking up books, regardless of whether it's first person or third person, you tend to stick with a character for a certain amount of time, and if you switch perspectives, there will be a page break or sometimes a formal chapter change. Frank Herbert doesn't really do that. So you can say it's just third person omniscient, but I think it goes a step beyond that. When I think omniscient, I think that the narrator is almost their own character, and then they're filling you in on what individual characters are thinking at any given time. Frank Herbert will just hop into any character's head at any time. There's a scene that didn't make the movie that's in the books that's one that gets discussed a lot, which is a dinner scene where you will jump from one character's head to the next and just see what they're thinking, and then they'll kind of signal to each other, which they do in the movie. They'll signal something to each other, and then you get that character thinking about what that other character just signaled to them, and then you'll go to another character noticing that that character doesn't seem to be reacting, and it can be a little disorienting. But it's not disorienting, I would say, because it's just so hard to follow, but rather we're so unaccustomed to that nowadays in books. Next up, we have Witcher. I am a huge Witcher fan. I've done quite a few videos on Witcher before, so I'll have my entire playlist linked. But first off would be the way that the books themselves, the order of them. So you actually start with 2 collections of short stories, the first being The Last Wish, the second being Sword of Destiny. The Last Wish is primarily what the first season of the show focused on. The second season of the show, if you've gotten around to it, kind of shows you Sword of Destiny as well as a little bit of the first book in the actual series called Blood of Elves. I'll have it very clearly where you can see the reading order. It starts with those 2 collections of short stories, and then it dives into a main series. It is advised to read the short stories first. They're going to provide you a lot of context to the series itself, and also if you truly are wanting to see what the source material is that the show is pulling from, you're going to want to read those collections of short stories. You're going to see some that are truly an entire episode was dedicated to a certain short story, and then you'll get some extras that weren't even in the show. There is a reveal at the end of season 2 that is technically not given to you in the books until basically the end of the series, but don't worry, you don't need to read through all of the books if you're just wanting to catch up with where the show is. You can basically just read through the 2 collections of short stories and then Blood of Elves, that first book in the actual series, and you'll be good to go. Also, a lot of people wonder about the video game. It's been highly successful. So there's 3 games, and the third one, The Wild Hunt, is the one that is probably the most well recognized. It's what a lot of people ended up getting into Witcher through, myself included, and it is fantastic, but it's technically not considered canon. It is a what-if scenario that takes place after the events of the books. So if you are wanting to check out the game, just know there might be some things mentioned there that perhaps could kind of spoil where the show is going. The show might also do things differently because, again, it's a what-if scenario with the game, so that's not exactly what ends up... I mean, they took some liberties, and a lot of liberties that people really are gravitating toward and like, but if you're going to pick up the game, just know you might be jumping ahead in time quite a bit. Witcher is also a translated work that was originally written in Polish. So you're going to find that the sentence structure is not really what we're accustomed to seeing in a lot of Western-inspired fantasy stories. And from what I understand from Polish readers, one, it reads much better in Polish, though I don't think it reads poorly in English necessarily. It's just apparently Andrzej Sapkowski has a way with words in the Polish language, and you don't quite get to see that in the English translation. And then also, it's very funny. I think the books are actually a lot funnier than the show. The games, I would say, are actually pretty funny too. But the books have a lot of humor in them, and it's kind of dry humor. It's actually very fun. But they're really grim, they're really dark, they're not the easiest to follow. If you watched my review for the entire second season, I talk about how in the books you will often be presented with characters who you've never met. You'll get a long time with them, and then you won't see them again, but something that they discuss will impact our main characters, and the show has done a good job of fleshing out these other things, and I think personally making you care a little bit more about them or making the impact clearer. But Andrzej Sapkowski definitely doesn't hold your hand pretty much at all, and it almost takes rereading or looking into stuff that mega fans have said to help you out a little bit. Might take reading more than once, but either way, I think it's not the easiest of fantasy series to read, but it's, in my opinion, very worthwhile. It's great to see where a lot of inspiration has come, and in general, if you're a fan of the dark gray morality and grimness and bleakness, but also tied with fairy tale retellings, then I think you're going to really like the Witcher series. Next up, we have Shadow and Bone. So if you're wanting to jump into the series, the most important thing I think to note is that the show combined characters from 2 different series that never really meet in the books. So it seems a little confusing, but the way they did it is actually pretty ingenious, and this is one of the few times that I think the TV show actually, every single change they made improved the story. Almost every fan, even people who love the source material, ended up liking the show more, which is really rare. Almost always with fantasy stories, everybody's like, the books were better, and this is one of the few times people are like, yeah, they actually they made it better. So Shadow and Bone, the trilogy, which previously a lot of people referred to as the Grisha trilogy, that's where you're going to want to start if you do want to read things chronologically in the order they were released and also the order of events in the books. In this particular trilogy, we follow Alina, who is our main character in the show. The side characters known as the Crows as you would expect by the names, appear in the Six of Crows duology. However, the events that take place with those characters in the show, those are all made up. Some of it is backstory referenced in the Six of Crows duology, but everything happening in present day in Six of Crows, you will not have seen in Shadow and Bone. So technically, you can watch Shadow and Bone, and you will not be spoiled for Six of Crows, even though Six of Crows characters appear in the TV show. I have a whole video going into this a little bit further in case it's a little confusing, so I'll have that linked if you'd like to check that out. But if you don't want to really read the Shadow and Bone trilogy, you don't have to. That one is far more youthful, and at this point it is slightly older, so it's a little bit tropey, and for some people it's a little outdated. Some of the things that our character is experiencing are a little stereotypical, and some things that people are a little tired of seeing. We only follow Alina as well in that trilogy. When we get to Six of Crows, something that the author did that I think a lot of really talented authors do is they aged up the story as their readers aged up. So Six of Crows is much more mature, still young adult for sure, but it is definitely much more mature, and I would say leans older young adult. The characters, you kind of have to suspend disbelief, of course, because they're really young teenagers acting like 35-year-olds with like really dark pasts and things like that, but the character examination in those stories is fantastic. The way that the author utilizes flashback sequences, which is something that's not always the easiest to do, they do a phenomenal job with, and then also all of these characters feel very real. And if you really enjoyed the Shadow and Bone show, but you're not so sure you want to pick up the trilogy, you can jump into Six of Crows and Crooked Kingdom. Just know you will be jumping ahead of the show. I believe Six of Crows is getting its own spin-off show, and so I'm guessing that's where we're going to see some of our characters again, but chronologically it does take place after the TV show. Six of Crows is definitely much heavier. We follow 6 different characters over the course of the duology, 6 main characters, and they all have their baggage. They all have something that makes them very deep and complex and nuanced, and I really, really enjoy both for what they are. I think if you're an older individual who doesn't really want perhaps something too young, you might want to skip Shadow and Bone and just go straight into Six of Crows. If you're somebody who you really want to see what the source material is that they're pulling from, then definitely go for Shadow and Bone. Just know it's going to be much younger. And as far as timeline goes, the first book, which is literally just called Shadow and Bone, is what the first season is based off of. Pretty much everything with the crows is made up, so you don't have to worry about spoilers there. And then if you're going to pick up the second and third books, you are going to get ahead of the show. If you want to pick up Six of Crows, Crooked Kingdom, you are going to get ahead of the show. But I don't think this is a situation where knowing what's going to happen is going to ruin the show. I had read the trilogy multiple times. I'd read Six of Crows multiple times before watching the show, and I just thought it was super fun to see these characters come to life. I don't think reading the books first is a must. I don't think watching the show first is a must. I think you can go either way, and it's just fun. And it's a little bit more family-friendly, perhaps, than something like Witcher, and maybe not as complex and deep as something like Dune. And then last we have Wheel of Time. I'd read the first 4 books in the Wheel of Time series, of which there are 14, which I think is important to note, because if you're wanting to read the source material, you're going to have to read a lot. There's 14 books in the main series, and then there is a prequel for a total of 15 books. This is a story that was written a little bit ago, not as old as Dune, and it does, I think, show that it's a product of its time in some ways, but still this is a very well-loved series. And I think one of the biggest things that fans love about Wheel of Time is how huge the world is, how much Robert Jordan dives into culture and the details that he focuses on that really make everything come to life and make this whole world feel extremely real. He also explores gender dynamics within this fantasy story. I think the show has changed certain aspects of it while still hinting at this same sorts of things. And of course, we'll see where the show goes because we've only gotten 1 season of it thus far. If you're watching this and you've been watching my videos for a while and you're a fantasy fan, you likely already know this, but if you're new, this series actually was completed by another author. Robert Jordan passed away before he could complete the series, and then the very well-known fantasy author Brandon Sanderson finished out the series. He was a big fan of it beforehand, and he also was able to take a lot of Robert Jordan's notes. And fans really seem to be very satisfied with how Brandon Sanderson wrapped up the series. My husband also would be one of those people. He's read all of it. He thinks Sanderson wrapped it up very well. His brother thinks Sanderson wrapped it up very well. A lot of my friends would agree. So I know there's a lot of, oh, but the story was incomplete. There's these fears sometimes that people have. You don't need to worry about that. Robert Jordan was, in every way, very detailed, not just with the story within the story, but his detailing of what he wanted to have happen. As for what events the show is taking from the books, you can read the first book and you should be pretty good, although there's certain things that are kind of pulled from the second book. But for the most part, Brandon Sanderson himself has stated that you can basically just read the first book and you'll be good. If you read ahead of that, you are going to get ahead of where the show is. I would love to know which of these 4 things have you personally watched. Have you watched all 4 of them? Have you watched some of them? Which thing was your favorite if you have watched more than one of these? But anyway, thanks so much for watching. I hope this was helpful. I hope you have a lovely rest of your day, and I'll see you all later. Bye.